There were once many magicians who knew how to give money a little puff. People all over the country bought houses and houses and houses. But that really, they could have been buying roses and roses and roses. Or canaries and canaries. And canaries. It didn't really matter to the magicians as long as they could get that money to puff up greatly. Not just anyone could puff up money quite like that. It took magic, and a special magic, where magicians convince people they are seeing something that doesn't really exist.
Which one is larger?
Blue. 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 Pink. Blue.
Now which one is larger?
After all, in this particular story with this particular cast of magicians, most didn't make money off actual houses, those shelters where people stayed dry from the elements. Instead, magicians made money puff from a circus of bets made about money people promised to pay to keep those houses. Sometimes now, looking back at the puffy money, the storms of money brushing against the shutters of all those shelters, sometimes now you might hear voices in television boxes saying,
all those people making promises on all those shelters, all those people are the problem with the economy today.
And we might imagine thousands of IOUs, those mortgages, dripping ash in the fire. And we might look at some of those promises, those IOUs, and think, what wacky, dreadful promises. After all, some people were trying to puff up money by flipping houses like pancakes on a griddle. But they weren't the real magicians. They weren't trying to puff money from nothing. They still needed a real house with maybe a door and some windows. If all those promises powdered like ashes in the fire, if all those mortgages had gone bad, well, this economy wouldn't have smashed like Humpty Dumpty wobbly on a wall. No, the magicians puffed up money to a puff at least 10 times the amount of all those promises, those IOUs, those mortgages. And when all those magicians found out their puffy money lost its puff, that's when the banks lost their puff, and all the king's horses and all the king's men put some of those banks back together again. Or rather, we did. But that's getting ahead of the story. You might ask just how the magicians puffed up money to quite that puff. Reveal your magic tricks, magician. Well, if we had a sack full of houses, thousands and thousands of houses, and smashed them up and shook the bag, we might piece them back together again into a bunch of Frankenstein houses. Only when the magicians did this, they didn't worry about the houses which could have been tulips or wheat or the air we breathe. They just took all those promises, those IOUs, and shook those in a bag and cut them up and made Frankenstein mortgages called securities, or more specifically in this case, where they added all kinds of funny tricks like insurance for default, collateralized debt obligations. And then they piled those risky, smashed up mortgages into tranches. No, not branches. I said tranches.
Tranche, monsieur, tranche.
But even though the magicians borrowed a French word for slice that lent a bit of finesse, they mostly talked about those tranches like levels, like stories in a building, where the bottom level might protect the higher ones. And that bottom tranche was one place in the story where it gets really hazardous, like a sky of dragons or a moat of crocodiles. People could barely pay these mortgages because so many were just so foul. What the magicians needed were lots and lots of mortgages, lots and lots of people buying houses, and it didn't really matter if people could afford the deals they signed. Wild deals, deals that had exploding arms. Mortgages that became too crazy expensive, sky high into impossibility, like more than all the money than the amount that people brought home from their job if they had a job. Or there were these negative amortizing mortgages where people got further and further behind, like someone trying to run to the next town, strapped on a treadmill on a go-kart, rolling backwards. And if a person couldn't pay that mortgage, a banker wasn't looking down the street at a neighbor who would lose her home. Instead, lots of magicians were waving wands around bits of the mortgage. And who knew who owned what anymore? And children, this is the time to listen closely. And really, who knows who owns what anymore? Now that the banks are trying to grab those millions of houses, the banks have to grab them whole. Not doors to some, shutters to others, but since that's how they owned them or sold them through those collateralized debt obligations, it's all rather confusing. And now the paperwork is fluttering, fortune cookie flimsy, and some banks hired some people to sign names rapid fire to papers foreclosing on the houses without reading all the words and the phrases. And it's all rather dodgy and shoddy and shammy. Really, stay tuned to that story, which is still being written. But back to the magic tricks. Magic tricks that also involve bunches of triple A's, A's, that rating agencies dashed across the tranches like frantic school teachers with frantic pens grading papers in a house of mirrors. And folks and governments all over the world thought, what a high grade that is. A great place to stash money, people's pensions and such. And of course, the magicians learned to make lots of money by charging fees for every which thing. It's like they sold tickets, not just for the show, but also every magic trick. And not just every magic trick, but every gesture, sword brandish, everything. Fees, fees, fees. Well, the magicians knew that they could only puff up money so much by owning bits of real houses, albeit fragments of title scotch taped together in a way. They could puff up money much, much more if they were buying lots of other invisible things too. Velcro, a magic trick called the credit default swap, onto the collateralized debt obligations, and sleight of hand over sleight of hand, you have the synthetic collateralized debt obligation, which also meant placing bets on whether folks' mortgages would go bad. Talk about trading in ill will. Folks could bet without owning anything, like betting that a house in the next town would blaze into flames one day. Or, if we were talking about walking dogs, which is a good sort of exercise and a job for some, our magician wouldn't be walking his dog named Roscoe. He'd be walking his invisible dog named Roscoe. And wait, he'd be walking that invisible dog named Roscoe in a mirror. And sometimes all we would see is a mirror of a mirror of a mirror. Because endless amounts of synthetic collateralized debt obligations could be created. And talk about puff. The magicians puffed up the money way beyond anything anyone paid toward a mortgage. And these synthetic collateralized debt obligations were so make-believe, they didn't even show up on accounting ledgers. All they did was show up enough to crash the economy. But there are a couple of plot details I forgot to mention. Join me, if you will, 6 years back in time, in a basement of the Securities Exchange Commission. The Securities Exchange Commission used to tell the magicians that they couldn't puff up money to more than 12 times its size. This was called the net capital rule, and had been around since 1975. But again, come springtime, 2004, the commissioner said, okay, magicians, you can puff up money to 30 times its size. They cheered on that puff, and the big banks took a bow and maybe said thank you. As long as I tell that part of the story, I might as well back up more. Let's gaze toward 1999, that millennial cusp, when Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. No, not Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall. The Glass-Steagall Act had been around since 1933 to keep the magicians from running into all the banks to puff up money. They were supposed to stay in their puff palaces, the investment banks, and away from the commercial banks. But in 1999, down that came, and the magicians came running into the commercial banks with their wands and their hats. They were happy to have so many more props to play with, like mortgages that could be shook up in a bag. And we know from our story that so many mortgages were foul, even though the magician said that lots of folks could pay. Lots of folks couldn't, because people aren't made of money. They can't conjure it from the air. No matter how many hours they work at the factory or bakery or phone bank or IT office or HR department or wherever. And the next year, with the magicians roaming freely between their palaces and the government buildings, Congress passed the Commodities Futures Modernizations Act with incantations to block any regulations on these magic tricks. Perhaps this story is foreshadowed in the words we use, since words like mortgage and amortizing, which describes what mortgages do, are rooted in mort, which comes from the word death as in mortality. And while we're at it,
Oh man, that got hurt.
and while we're at it, the fin in finance is like that too, as in finished, final, or kaput. And that's what happened to so many mortgages and all the puff around them, finished, final, kaput. It turned out the magicians could only conjure money for so long. For what tale am I telling you?
A tale of magicians who puffed out money that lost its puff.
That's right, and the money lost its puff. And this economy smashed, maybe not like Humpty Dumpty wobbly on a wall, but like the magicians recklessly smashing old Humpty Dumpty hard.
Oh! Poor Humpty Poor Humpty Dumpty. You did that?
And all the people's government and all the people's taxes rushed to fix the banks again. And cash oozed into the puff palaces, those big banks. And those magicians said they would lend more out. They said they saw us. They beckoned to all of us. Again and again, the magicians tell us that this new congressional law or that financial trick or whatever will help everyone out. And then they keep the money to grow their profits, and this just seems to happen again and again. The magicians mostly stash money in the palaces and pass it among each other like birthday presents every day, because as a condition of their bailout, which they mostly wrote, they didn't have to account for how they spent the money. Meanwhile, people got and get poorer. If the magicians keep us believing in their made-up world, where lots of numbers and first-class flights and phone calls equals values, they'll puff up money around lots of other real things like water or wheat or tulips. Or the air we breathe. Today, I've told a tale of magic tricks, a killjoy tale a sinister tale, a tale of lousy magic. But this is an evening tale, and the sky is dark, and we're easing towards sleep. So let's wish for magicians we would queue up to see. Wouldn't we queue up for a magic that refused reckless profits for a few, while concerning itself with the many in this world? Wouldn't we queue up for a magic conjured so that all people and the ecosystems we are among are what flourish? Now that's a magic I like. Now wouldn't we queue up for a magic that makes shelters for all, not mansions for a few? Now that's a magic I like. Because the magicians of finance seem to have written most of us out of their story. I like a magic that pictures all of us too. And pictures us vividly. Now that's a magic we like.
Oh, poor chicken.